I'm Jay Moran.
I'm Bridget Jaipal Valenza.
I'm Thomas O'Neill White.
I'm Angela Preston.
We need to get together and let our voices be heard.
This is What's Next, a dedicated hour to have important conversations about the issues facing the marginalized and underrepresented communities of Western New York and Southern Ontario.
If we're going to have some real healing, we've got to have space to tell some uncomfortable truth.
What's Next continues our mission to discuss race,
Equity,
And the common concerns of Buffalo's East Side and beyond.
In the suburban area, everywhere, we must work and teach our children.
Welcome to What's Next. Today with us, we have Professor Marcus Watson from Buffalo State University, Associate Professor of Africana Studies and Individualized Studies as well. Professor Watson, appreciate your time today.
Thank you for having me.
We got a lot to talk about here, and I want to get into one of the things that you brought up to me just as we were starting off. You have an Intro to Africana Studies course, and I mean, we take intro courses, of course, because we want to learn more about things, but I'd like to think that in a lot of other fields, you walk into an intro course, you probably have some understanding, maybe more than just a little bit of understanding, but you, from what you explained to me, that's not necessarily the case with a lot of your students.
That is correct. I've been teaching courses like this in Africana Studies for some time. I was at the University of Wyoming for 9 years, and I was partly in the Black Studies or Africana Studies program there as well. So I taught courses like this there, and now I'm teaching at Buffalo State for 4 years just in Africana Studies. And yes, one thing that is a clear pattern is that the students who are mostly first-year students, just graduated from high school, taking Africana Studies courses, just about all admit that they haven't heard of hardly any of the names, the events, the places, and significant historical situations that have something to do with Black folks. Whether it's in the U.S. or globally. And that's it's concerning on a number of levels. I mean, it's one thing if you walk into an intro course for a different major, a different discipline, and you don't know much, especially if those courses are not about a people, especially from a historical perspective, a much maligned and oppressed people. But Africana Studies is different than a lot of those majors in the sense that it is about bringing the thoughts and the experiences of African people, wherever they may be in the world, to the light of day, right? It's that one place on a university campus, or one of very few places on a university campus where students get exposure, right, to African thought, right? Africana Studies is where Black thought matters, right? We talk about Black Lives Matter from the perspective of higher ed, right? Africana Studies is where Black thought matters, or is supposed to matter, right? So for students to have almost no clue about anyone or anything other than Dr. King and Rosa Parks, and maybe a few others, is alarming in itself, because from an Africana perspective, we have an understanding that most fundamentally, education is about the survival of a people, right? So it says a lot, right, about Black folks and our efforts at survival, right, if the education system is not helping in that regard. It's also enlightening in a sense, because what tends to be in the news, I think, is the banning of Africana Studies type of courses in places like Florida. And we in the North, and maybe in New York in particular, many of us, it's easy, I think, for us to look at Florida and wag a big finger at them. How dare they? But the more I do Africana studies here in the North and realize that our education system is producing young folks who also have no clue about Black history, it makes it clear that the methods of erasing Black history might be different, but the value is the same. Right.
That's a very powerful way to describe that reality. But, I mean, it's a long time ago when I was in high school, so I can't, but I don't remember, like you said, Martin Luther King, maybe Rosa Parks, and then pretty much anything else would have been, centered around what white presidents may or may not have done. Let's maybe just get into just a little bit your Africana studies. So I walk in day one. What's opening my eyes? Like you said, most of them, I'm coming in like everybody else. I don't know a lot of the dates, and I don't know a lot of the events. What are some of those that really seem to capture your students' attention?
I think Gloria Richardson is someone who captures their attention. From 1962 to 1964, she led what was called the Cambridge movement in Maryland. Civil rights movement, segregation was how things worked there. Blacks on one side of a street, whites on the other side of a street. And she got into the movement. She became the leader of it. And she herself represented a transition from the classical civil rights movement that we associate with Dr. King, the nonviolent types of resistance, the efforts at integrating into the system of exploitation, if you will. The transition from that to the Black Power movement, which was much more, if you mess with me, we got trouble. I want freedom now, right? No excuses. So she represents a kind of transition figure. And she's most famous for a photograph in which she is walking in the street and she's walking past someone in the military, a white male, who has a bayonet gun pointing in her direction. And she's looking at him, staring right into his face and pushing the gun away. I let students look at that image for a minute because it's powerful. Now, she's a transitionary figure, I would say, because she still wants in, like Dr. King in the classical civil rights, but she wants integration. But you could tell that she wasn't very tolerant of doing it slowly, right, or turning another cheek, right? And so she started, getting into that Black Power approach, right, to trying to rebalance relations, right, between people in this country. So she's someone who captures the imagination of the students, and not least because during the famous March on Washington, there were, first of all, very few women included in it. But she was on stage and was scheduled to speak. But when she went up and took the microphone, all she could utter was hello before the microphone was taken from her.
Oh.
And it is said that because the dominant leadership at the time, again, associated with Dr. King, but Bayard Rustin and Fred Shuttlesworth and these kind of folks, were afraid of what she might say that was outside of their script, right? That had a lot to do with trying to come off right to the white power structure while still trying to get these gains, right, for Black folks and other folks. So she's one of our ancestral heroes, right? Who's little known, but who was making history. Another thing said about her is that Malcolm X, again, who's one of the iconic figures of Black Power,
Certainly.
right? That he didn't mention a lot of other freedom fighters positively in his speeches, but he did mention Gloria Richardson. He had such respect for her, that he does mention her in a speech. So, yeah.
And what's the student's reaction when at that picture? It speaks volumes as you described it. Here's a black woman in a segregated area pushing away the symbol of power, symbol of something that could perpetuate violence upon somebody. What is the student's reaction to that?
I think they're in awe. They sit there and look at that picture, and I give them the time to. I think there's a sense of surprise and shame that they don't know about someone like this. And I would like to think that it gives them a sense of what's possible, what has been done, but also what is possible. Right? I think that's one of the consequences, one of the negative consequences of not knowing history well, right, is that we lack images and names and strategies of what people have done before, and therefore what I can identify with and what's possible for me today.
It's fascinating to hear you talk about your class. I'm curious if you have seen, you've only been in Buff State now for 4 years, but have you seen a surge of interest in Africana studies?
I don't know if it's a surge, but there's growing interest. First of all, the same year I was hired at Buffalo State, fall of 2019, was the same year we got a major, right? We were offering a minor for decades. And obviously there was work done in the years leading up to me being hired as part of a cohort, actually, who were going to contribute to Africana Studies. But as we came in, it was announced that Africana Studies now offers a major. Then, within months, we had COVID, and so there was never really a chance to promote it or recruit until after COVID. But after COVID, we went from one major, it grew to 3 in a few months, maybe in a year and a half, it was 7, and we are at 15 now.
Congratulations.
Thanks. And about the same number of minors. So, yeah, I think it is growing as students recognize the power of it. Now, the problem is it is not a requirement, right? So like Intro to Africana Studies is not a requirement at Buffalo State.
Should it be?
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, yes. But it is, right now, what it serves to do is to allow students to check off that they satisfied a diversity requirement.
Okay.
So it is a choice or an option among several courses students can take to check the diversity box. The problem is if we get in one semester, let's say 150 to 200 students to take several sections of Intro to Black Studies, there are thousands more who aren't taking it. And if you get through your 4 years at Buffalo State and you didn't even take Intro to Black Studies, you might as well be 80 at that point, and you still don't know anything about Black people,
Right.
Black history, Black experiences, and so forth. So that's why I say, to the extent that we believe that understanding Black experience, Black history, and Black thought is vitally important to injecting a sense of justice and bringing back a sense of camaraderie and trust among us as Americans, then it's essential that Africana studies should be something learned, studied by students.
It isn't. It's interesting what you say about Buffalo State. My daughter actually just graduated from there last year, right? Yes, last year it was. And, the one thing about taking her to the school, and I think one of the things she appealed to her was the sense of diversity at the school. It's there's a large population of black students. It was not quite that way when I was there, those many decades ago. But at the same time, though, there is, as you're walking to the Union, you're walking around, you're going to be among a diverse population. Maybe there's still not the level of understanding that's needed.
I would agree with that. I think black as phenotype is different than black as philosophy, let's say.
Okay.
Right. So, yeah, I think there's value for sure in having a diverse student body, the opportunities for experiencing people of different backgrounds, and hopefully warming up to that, appreciating and being able to speak with our fellow human beings, right? Hopefully some of that comes out of just that mere fact, right, of the diversity of the student body. But there's no guarantee that black students have black philosophy, right? There's no guarantee that they are also not socialized to think Eurocentrically about things, right? So
they most likely are. Would
in a lot of ways.
Fair?
In
Yeah,
a lot of
yeah.
ways.
Mhm.
In a lot of ways, they probably are out of necessity and circumstance, right? Knowing the history of the country, and so even still, over and above just going to Buffalo State or going to a place that has a diverse student body, Africana Studies is different than that, right? And that this is where we offer systematic understanding, of black thought, African-centered perspectives. And I would dare say that in just about every other discipline or major, you're probably getting something that's founded on a Eurocentric perspective,
Right.
And so you're gonna get that, right? No matter what you major in,
Right.
you're gonna get that assumed in your very being, right? So that's a continuation of how we're socialized, more broadly, I think, in the society. So if you, right now, as it currently stands, if you want an alternative view, right? If you want to break out of the hegemonic normative, narratives and ways of understanding, you first of all, you'd have to know that you're getting a Eurocentric based
Sure.
education in most of the majors. Then you'd have to value a different, cultural understanding and perspective. And then you'd have to make the choice to at least take the intro course to satisfy the diversity,
Right.
if not major or minor in Africana Studies, right? To be different than, I think, the herd.
Is it? I don't want to. I was going to use the word struggle, but I'm looking more for a process. When it comes to getting students to understand that what they have learned is, as you just described it, Eurocentric. Is there a push-pull? I mean, trying to pull people out of that level of understanding. I mean, like you said, it's probably what they learned in high school and elementary school, and probably are seeing on the news and whatever other parts of culture that they're experiencing. Is there a little bit of that where you sir, you have to understand? You don't understand what's really at the core here.
I mean, I don't know what's exactly going on in the minds of students, but just based on their participation in the course, talking through issues and their writings, most of them seem to understand the basic power and points of Africana Studies and seem to value it and accept it. And that's students of all backgrounds.
Okay.
Now, what they do with that, I'm not quite sure. The idea would be that they would major in Africana Studies, understanding the power, right, of Africana thought that can be applied to any profession or industry, and that's the hope that that's what would be done in order to bring back balance and a sense of justice and harmony to our society. Or they may minor, right, and add it to something that they're still interested in. It could be fashion, for example. Lost my train of thought.
Yeah,
for a second.
like you said, though, that you think that it's interesting to note that once the students are in there, it does seem, based on their writings and their participation in class, that they're able to make that distinction about a Eurocentric study versus an Africana study, right?
Yeah. And I think I started remembering what I wanted to say. That there are other pressures, right? So they may come into the course, and we sort of talked about they didn't know any of these people or things had happened, and I think they feel energized to learn about it. They feel maybe some kind of subtle sense of guilt about not having known about it. And I suspect that there are students, a good number of students, who they might be wrestling with what should they do with Africana studies now that they've learned about it, and it's fulfilling something in their human spirit, right? That maybe was missing, because there's a lot of the students are coming from struggling kind of circumstances. A lot of them are sent to college, by parents, stakeholders who have an interest in them breaking out of the cycle. And then comes the stereotypes, right, about something like Africana studies, right? I've had students say, even majors, say that one of the hurdles for them to declare the major in Africana studies was their parents telling them, "What are you going to do with that? We sent you there for business, right? To do something that is, in their minds, very closely associated with making money." And so, trying to either convince these parents, or maybe just having tried to convince them and it didn't work, just moving forward anyway with something they know they value and that can produce jobs. But also, I think the students who do declare the major, they're interested not just in getting a job, but being at peace with themselves when they have the job, right? I think they understand there are plenty of so-called successful people who are lost to themselves, right, in the world.
Sure.
And that Africana studies, among many other things, helps to, it helps people find who they are, and I think there's something holistically just satisfying about that. And so those who major in that are interested, right? They like that feeling and move forward with it.
You mentioned, we talked about Gloria Richardson as a kind of key figure who kind of helps start off the course to a certain extent. What about where else an intro course would take us, where you're trying to build this thought, to give this initial understanding of Africana studies? Take us around the globe, if you don't mind,
Sure.
Professor Watson.
Sure. I think to answer that question, just you have to start with history. Now, Africana studies is multidisciplinary.
Okay.
The expertise of Africana studies faculty is essentially Black liberation and the understanding that when you do know history and how societies are working around the world, that if we can address that many other of the diversity issues syllogistically, right, become unstabilized or destabilized and undone, right? So it's Africana studies is a force for trying to bring about this society I think we want, right? But through African-centered perspective. So getting the students to understand, in this case, the importance of history, even though it's not I might teach a history course that counts for Africana studies because history is my expertise. But I also might teach a dance course that counts for Africana studies, or philosophy course, or psychology course. But what binds all of those courses together is this expertise in Black liberation and therefore human liberation. Right? So having students understand the importance of history. And students are there, they're first year students. Some of them are undeclared in terms of their major. Some of them probably are not interested in history at all when they come in the course. So getting them to understand that the vital importance of history, of knowing one's own history, and of getting that history relatively right, and accurate, is a huge part of these intro courses. After the intro course, they venture out into Africana dance, Africana psychology, Africana economics, Africana political science, Africana philosophy, and so forth. But I give them this this image that people like Malcolm X have said, and others, that history, the importance of history is like a tree trying to stand without roots. A tree trying to stand without roots. So once we establish, looking into the eyes of these students, many of whom, as you said, are Black, people of African ancestry, but not all, looking into their eyes and starting to hear feedback from them verbally and in written form that I had no clue about my history, right? And how upset they are about that, but also how empowered they feel to be learning about it. So after we establish, right, that we've all been socialized, including me when I was their age, in an educational system that doesn't teach you about anything except I have a dream. We've reduced, an entire complex man's life to a quote. Mm-hmm. And the quote isn't even really that representative of his thoughts. But so once we establish that, then it's okay. Now, can a tree stand without its roots? And students will say, well, no, so how about a people? Can a people stand without roots? And they get the metaphor and they'll say, well, no, but they'll even take it further and say, actually, a tree without roots, it's not even really a tree. Like, roots are a defining feature of a tree, right? So, but then that makes them think, wait a minute, so are we even a people? Right? Are we even a people? And of course, the answer within an Africana studies perspective is yes. But when that history is erased, right, we start operating as if we are not a people, right? And that brings on all kinds of other calamities, right? So that is kind of another crucial moment, right, in the Intro to Africana Studies course, right, is talking about the importance of history. And after that, we're developing that to say, can you tell the history of the modern world without talking about white supremacy, right? Anti-Black racism, and so forth, and related, kinds of injustices, and they start kicking that around, and it's uncomfortable probably for some of the students, right, to say, even utter the words white supremacy. But as they start thinking through things like the higher you go in almost any industry, the whiter and more male it becomes. Whether it's sports teams and ownership, who's playing versus who owns them, or if you look at a picture of congressmen and women, or the Senate, or the fashion industry, whatever when they start connecting the pieces and start, most of them, I think, start coming to the understanding, like, yeah, I kind of get what white supremacy is now. And I don't know how one would speak almost about anything in the so-called modern world without white supremacy being a variable, right? Not the only variable. So then we start talking about history in terms of, let's say we are in a ditch, right? The ditch being a metaphor for their distrust between people is at an all-time high. We have school shootings. I think at some point, maybe a couple weeks ago, there was almost an equal number of mass shootings in the U.S. as there were days in 2024.
Yes.
Right. We see what's going on in Gaza and so forth. Not trying to come down either way on that thing, but just what's going on in the world, right? The U.S. violent interventions abroad, the current genocide going on in Congo, just things like that. So a metaphor for we're in a ditch. Like, this is not where humanity wants to be. Okay. So now we talk about history when it's better understood than it is now, being a kind of guiding light, right? History is the thing that tells you which way's up, how you got into the ditch, and then, how do you get out, right? And without that proper understanding of history, we might be good people, we might work hard, but a lot of our efforts, unbeknownst to ourselves, it could be digging the ditch deeper. You don't know where you're going, right? So that's how the course, kind of unfolds, toward the beginning of a course like that. Just a deeper understanding of the importance of history and why what they're learning in a course like this. And, thank you that you chose this one to satisfy your diversity requirement. Otherwise, you'd have been like the thousands who chose something else. And
Right.
4 years passed, you graduated, and then you're 80 years old and you never knew any of this, right?
Right.
It's kind of like imagine an arrow, that has a right angle in it, and you're trying to shoot that arrow. To me, that's like it's like humanity trying to get things right, shooting a crooked arrow, right? A proper understanding of history to me is like straightening out the arrow so that humanity can shoot straight, in terms of our lofty goals, for what we should be as humanity.
We are talking with Professor Marcus Watson from Buffalo State University, Associate Professor of Africana Studies and Individualized Studies as well.
You're listening to What's Next, our place to discuss the important issues of our communities of Western New York and Southern Ontario. We want to hear from you. Click on the Talk to Us option in the WBFO app, and we will work to get your questions or comments on the air. Do you have a story or concern that we should be addressing? Email us using whatsnext@wbfo.org. Together we'll have the conversations that are needed. This is WBFO, your NPR station.
Professor Marcus Watson's with us from Buffalo State University, Associate Professor of Africana Studies. You mentioned a little while ago how you'd like to think and maybe even see inside your students who start learning and understanding Africana Studies, maybe a sense of peace, perhaps, of understanding themselves a little bit more. How about for you? Was that a situation for you as you grew as an individual?
That's a great question. My full name is Marcus Du Bois Watson. And I say that because some of our listeners may recognize these names, right? I'm 100% Black of biracial parentage, okay? And I'm 50 years old. So in those days, I grew up in an age where there weren't really choices in terms of your identity. You were Black or white in those days, right? So my parents, were also socialized in that kind of America, and both of them made sure that I knew I was Black, okay? And they thought it was nonsensical that I would think I was anything else, okay? So they agreed to name me after two Black freedom fighters. One is Marcus Garvey, and the other W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, I say that because I'm not sure how much my upbringing resonates or is common with other Black folks in terms of that kind of high degree of Black consciousness. So for me, my upbringing was more so from birth, being socialized within a family context and not having the kind of saturated exposure to other ideas through things like social media of just being prideful about being Black, being prideful about being Black. I remember after my parents were divorced and my brother and I lived mostly with my father after that, my father may have had other things hung up on the wall, but the only thing I remember is a piece of white typing paper turned sideways with it written on it, February 21st, 1965.
Okay.
In my father's handwriting. And I probably didn't even know what it was for a while, but as I grew older and became more intellectually interested, right, I learned that is the date of the assassination of one of our greatest ancestor heroes, Malcolm X. Right? That was the only thing on the wall, right? And I'm named for 2 Black freedom fighters. My father changes his name legally from Robert to Uhuru. Uhuru meaning freedom in Swahili. So all that to say, what many students may be experiencing as a kind of jolt to their beings, going through an Intro to Africana Studies course and then hopefully going on to major or minor in Africana Studies, I think I experienced in a more gradual way growing up, I'm very grateful for that. I'm grateful when I look back over my consciousness and its development from childhood till now, there's no major disruption or jolts, like some of my students may be experiencing. What I see when I look back over my evolving consciousness is a love of self as a Black person and a pride in having African ancestry going all the way back. And I think because of that, I feel really healthy, And it's not about disliking anybody else. I even said I come from biracial parentage, but it's the world is different and better when you know who you are and love who you are, I think.
You also have spent considerable time on the continent of Africa. Your wife is from Ghana, so there's a great attachment there. To talk to somebody who's had multiple experiences on the continent of Africa, I'm intrigued on a lot of different levels. But how about just for the first time stepping onto the continent, what that was like for you?
Yeah, traveling to the motherland was life transforming for me. I first got to the African continent through the Peace Corps, which is a quasi-government organization that sends mostly young folks, often graduates of college, overseas to help other countries with their developmental needs. Okay, so that brought me to the African continent. But when I applied, I was told, don't check a box that indicates you want to go to a very specific place.
Okay.
Because the people who review the essays, I was told, might see that as an indication of being a little closed-minded. And they wanted someone who's just worldly and just would go anywhere and it doesn't matter. So I checked no preference.
Okay.
But I hoped and prayed, send me to the African continent.
Okay.
And they did
right.
send me to South Africa. In fact, I was part of the very first cohort of Peace Corps volunteers to ever go to South Africa. This was 1997. If we know our history, we know South Africa gains independence post-apartheid in 1994. So I was there just 3 years after apartheid ends and Nelson Mandela is elected president. And I remember being excited that I get to go to the African continent, mostly because when I had listened to some of the speeches of Malcolm X when I was a senior in high school, I don't know if he said it explicitly, but the message was there for sure that if you are Black, you should know the African continent, you should connect to the African continent, if not go to the African continent, as he did multiple times. And so I really felt like I was heeding the advice of one of our greats, by when I got to go to the African continent. And so I felt that way. I felt prideful being on the plane, flying over there. But I also remember telling myself, Marcus, you know nothing. Marcus, you know nothing. Because I had already known Africans from the continent before I left, right here in Buffalo. And I could tell in my relationships with them that there were cultural differences. And I liked those differences, and I was learning from them, but it taught me, don't go there being the quote unquote ugly American, thinking you know everything and that you're there to bring anything to anybody. I knew I was going to be the one among the thousands, whatever community I ended up being in, and that if I was wise and maybe ethical, that I would take the lead from the people who know what they're doing, who speak in their language. It's their place, right? And so I went with that kind of mindset. And because I did, I think the learning curve was great. I learned a lot. I learned quickly. I learned the language, the values, and it enriched me. And it made certain things make sense, like the loudness of black folks. You know? I mean, it's a stereotype. We're not all loud, but there's a stereotype behind that, you know. And
but you felt it. You felt it. You heard it. Yeah.
I was like, oh, so this is why. You know, when you are considered a quote unquote minority, I don't like that word, right? In a different, you know, culture, you know, inevitably you're going to be sort of seen as different, right? And I think the human spirit doesn't want to be different. The human spirit wants to be part of. Connect, right? So, you know, you spend all these years being socialized to feel different, and that can come with questions like, what's wrong with me? And, you know, and how can I get past this? Should I assimilate? You know, is becoming more white, so to speak, the way to go? Is that going to get me out of this? So realizing that there's a whole continent of people who make things make sense, you know, to you was empowering. Again, it was life transforming. I ended up spending 7 years living on the African continent, mostly in South Africa and Ghana, but I have visited 13 African countries, ended up marrying someone from Ghana. We are 24 years married now.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
4 children. That's pretty good too.
Yep.
Yep. 13 countries. What else would you like to say about going to those countries? I'm as you know, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. You're like talking right at the beginning about what it's like for these students when they come into Africana studies, and a lot of ignorance, right? When it comes in, and there's no doubt about it when it comes to Africa, that most certainly is a fair generalization, I would say, for most people. What would you like to tell us about Africa?
Well, I think the low-hanging fruit for answering a question like that is that don't believe the stereotypes, right? I think often Africa is depicted as the image of a starving child. There might be flies on the eyes of that child. There might be a distended belly, or else warfare.
There's warfare on all the continents.
Right. There's warfare everywhere. And right, so those kinds of stereotypes, I would say, do away with them. It's not that stereotypes don't capture something of reality, but it's just stereotypes capture, I would say, very little of a complex reality. There have been multiple times in my life driving out of a Walmart from Wyoming, where I used to live, to here, and meeting what looks like white folks who are panhandling or asking for $1, you know, as I'm driving out of Walmart, and I often give them something. But the point is, what if the United States was represented around the world with the image of that person asking for something outside of Walmart? You know, what if that was the image going all around the globe and they said, this is what America is? I mean, first of all, it would not capture the total complex reality of America, but also America wouldn't like to be viewed that way or represented that way, right?
Yes.
Same way, the African continent, of course, reviles, being depicted, right, in those negative ways in a place like the United States. Africa is much more complex than that. There are metropolises there, enormous cities, Accra, Johannesburg, Cape Town, Dar es Salaam, so on and so forth. And one thing I would say about, every African place I went to, and there are 54 African countries, right? Africa is not one big country. Now, are there similarities across African cultures in the same way we can say there's something like Europe, right? There are differences there, but there's something in common that we can still say it's Europe, right? Same thing with the African continent. But there are 54 African countries. It is not one big country. But nevertheless, in all of the places I went, there is a stunning hospitality, right? That seems evident, wherever you go. I would even say about Ghana that if you go there and spend the first day or two there, if no one actually physically touched you in terms of holding your hand or giving you a hug, the way people talk to you and interact, for the most part, it almost feels like you're being hugged all the time, right? Which speaks to put it in simple terms, a collectivist, type of culture where people are socialized to understand their value, not against other people's value, but through other people, right? And so what that does is it, at a behavioral level, it really sensitizes people to how they speak, what they say. And that's where the way people are speaking to you, it always sort of feels like you're being pulled closer in a good way, almost like into an embrace or a hug.
Are the how prevalent are the signs of the imperialism that occurred in Africa? Do you find, again, not every country, there's 56 different countries, or is it 54, did you say? I apologize. So everybody's a little bit different, but how evident, how prevalent are the signs of that still?
It's very prevalent if you know where to look. If you're socialized into any one of the countries now, you're probably just saying this is your reality. If you don't take certain kinds of courses, or you don't gain certain kinds of knowledge that allow you to critically assess your surroundings, you'll probably just think things are normal and this is Africa, this is Gabon, or this is Central African Republic, or whatever. But if you know where to look, the signs of imperialism are staggeringly evident. One is the fact that there are countries at all, right? The fact that there are these European or Eurocentric things we call countries, right, is a byproduct of European colonization, right? Which we say officially starts in 1884-85 with the Berlin Conference, where representatives of European colonial powers get together in Berlin, Germany, and they have maps on the wall of Africa, and they talk about where their countries have had influence in the previous 200-300 years, and why that should be a justification for them taking over politically those particular areas. And they start drawing the lines on the maps, and that's where the countries we know today, have their origin. Now, we know that countries as we know them derive ultimately from 1648, the Westphalia Treaty, right, which was a small part of Europe trying to fix its bloody wars and problems with the idea of the nation state, right, or country. So the fact that idea of how to organize yourself has been exported to the rest of the world, who didn't have those. They had their own problems, but it wasn't those problems.
It wasn't here in North America.
Right. That a political formation that developed at a very particular time and place to address a certain problem has now been exported to places around the world where people didn't have those particular problems just adds to the complications and is another kind of manifestation of the imperial presence. And then, of course, you have people speaking European languages,
Right.
which doesn't have to be bad if it was really some kind of humane cross-cultural exchange. But, how many Brits or Germans or Italians are speaking Zulu, right? So same kind of thing. People, Africans having names, like Sophie or what have you. Again, it doesn't have to be bad if it was part of some kind of humane equal exchange. But again, how many, folks in the U.S. Have names like Kofi, or last names like Nkuna, right? So there's evidence there of something drastically unequal happened in history. And then I think more on a daily basis, you have phenomena still, unfortunately, like products for lightening skin, right, are still pretty prevalent. I think there is, thankfully, an uptick in African consciousness where there is an embrace and a love of black skin, right? But those products are still there, and some people are still doing that. So those are some of the manifestations of imperialism still being there.
Wow, it's I really appreciate the perspective on that for sure. We're down to just our last couple of minutes here, Professor. And I guess to that, finally, your students. What do you hope? I know that's not nice. Just what do you see from them when they're done? Their first introduction to Africana studies. What do they walk out of there with?
I think they walk out of that course, most of them, I would hope, having taken in the fact that there is more to knowledge than the mainstream narrative, which actually upholds white supremacy and anti-black racism, the status quo. I think they take out of the course that there is a lot of value in understanding black experiences and black thought. I have many of them come to me during the semester talking about how they've applied this kind of black perspective to other courses.
Wow, that's
right?
got to be tremendously gratifying.
It's gratifying, yeah. I wish I could save them and help them in those situations. But they'll talk about how, for example, maybe in a psychology course, not calling anyone out, this is just an example. I think it would be true in most of the courses, but how almost the whole history of a discipline, we talked about other introductory courses, might be laid out there for students, and the students questioning because of Africana studies. So there are no black people, no indigenous people, no Asian people, nobody else besides mostly rich white men, who contributed to the study of whatever, right?
Right.
And so some of them come back burning, asking me, is this true? And I have a background in black psychology, so I'll tell them no, and I'll point them in the direction of history makers, right, within the realm of black psychology in that case. And sometimes they'll say they actually dared to ask, what about black folks? And I suspect faculty at Buffalo State, as nice as we are, probably field the question nicely and trying to figure out how to answer those things. But yeah, so another hope or wish, expectation is that the students would take this knowledge and have their eyes open to things, right? When they're majoring in other things or when they go into their professions. The ideal is, first of all, that students would come to understand that, yes, you can get jobs majoring in Africana studies.
Right. Or English or
sociology or history or anything
humanities.
else. Right. Secondly, that we're making you super smart because we are getting you outside of the normal, kinds of grooved and regrooved types of ways of thinking. We're injecting a critical perspective, a creative perspective, and out-of-the-box kind of thinking that I think enriches you as a person, but also allows you to bring that to whatever profession that you're going into. We need Africana studies thinkers in medicine, in film, in communication, right? And all in fashion, all of these, in politics, right? So that would be the hope, right? That they take this knowledge and push the different industries and professions toward the future that I think we want.
I think you've given us a lot to think about, food for thought here today, Professor Watson. I really appreciate the conversation, and I hope you find a need to come back and maybe talk some more. Maybe we can expand on a couple other things as well. How does that sound?
That sounds great.
Professor Marcus Watts, Buffalo State University, with us on What's Next. This is What's Next on WBFO, WBFO HD1 Buffalo, WOLN Olean, WUBJ James, your NPR station.